Hey everybody, welcome to this session on beginning programming. My name is Dennis and I've been a programmer for just a few years really. I've been a programming hobbyist for many years, I guess, dating all the way back to high school. But after working for several decades in another career, I sort of got serious about learning some programming a few years ago. And one of the things I did early on was I took the Udacity front-end nano degree and learned a lot there. Also got some other education from other online sources and some self-study. And the end result of that was about this time last year, I began my first job in the tech world. I work as a web developer in kind of a very specialized way for a company here where I live. But what I'm here to do is to help you get started in programming and hopefully help you enjoy it as much as I do. And any questions I can answer along the way, I'm glad to do that. So many programmers have helped me and been very patient with me and continue to be very patient with me where I work. And if I can pay that back in some way to you, then I'm glad to do it. Today we're going to look a little bit at functions in JavaScript. And I think you'll enjoy it. Let me say that if we were doing a live session here, I would say interrupt me at any time and ask any questions that you have. So let's get to it. Let's begin by looking together at functions. Functions are a basic building block of programming in many languages, including JavaScript. I consider a function to be kind of like a miniature factory that I can turn to again and again in my program to do certain tasks. For example, let's say that I, in my program, needed to multiply 2 times 2, and then later on I needed to get the result of 3 times 2, and then later on 9 times 2, and you can imagine this, that's not very good typing there. 9 times 2. You can imagine that that would get very tedious, and in a program that runs many times, there's really no way for me to know in advance how many times I need to do it. What I really need is a tool that will, in fact, double any number that I send to it. And that's what this simple function that you see on the screen, in fact, does. This is a basic JavaScript function. It's a very simple one. And this is the general syntax that you would use in writing a function. You can start with the word function to define it as such. And then you give it a name. I've just chosen to call it double me. And let me show you something that's JavaScript convention, you might say. The way I've written out double me is in what's called camel case. I start with a lowercase letter, and my first word double is in there, but then instead of putting a space in there, which would break it, or an underscore, which perhaps would work, that's acceptable in JavaScript. A conventional way to draw a variable, to write a variable like this, or a function name or anything, is in camel case. So the first word is lowercase, and then every subsequent word is capitalized. First letter is capitalized. So there's the name of the function. Then in parentheses, in some functions there won't be anything between these parentheses, but between the parentheses is where you pass in an argument or a parameter. And so I've chosen to pass in the variable n, that stands for number. I could use anything there. I could use a word. I could use some other abbreviation. Let's just go with n for number. That's kind of convention. Followed by brackets. In JavaScript, the business of a function is enclosed in brackets. That's how our computer knows where it starts and where it stops. And then in between, I'm sure you understand this part right here. In between the brackets, I tell this function to take whatever n is and multiply it by 2. And usually I would have the word return before that, because usually if I'm writing a computer program, I want to return the result and use it in some other place. But for our purposes here, for demonstration, I'm going to console log it instead, which means I'm going to send it to the terminal when I run this program, and we'll be able to see the result. So that's really the whole function there. Now, this line you see below that says double me and has 2 slanted lines ahead of it, that's called a comment. In JavaScript, you can comment anything out Well, you can make yourself a comment. You can make yourself a note by putting those two slashes, those two lines in front of whatever you want, and that becomes a comment. You can write yourself a note there. You can comment something out so it doesn't run and the computer ignores it. But whatever comes after these two lines, the computer ignores it, becomes a comment. I have that commented out because I didn't want it to run. Now I'm going to take it out. This is how you call a function. I got the name here, double me, and I'm going to pass in the number 4. And what I expect this to do is, in fact, to pass a 4 into the function. And I expect my function to take 4 and multiply it by 2. And last time I checked, that should result in 8. So let's save it, and we'll go over here to the console and take a crack at it. Now I'm using a program called Node, which allows us to run JavaScript outside of the browser. We'll explain more about that sometime in the future. But I want to use Node and then run my program, which is called functions.js. And what do I get back? Well, I typed something wrong. So let's take a look at that and see what I've done here. I've misspelled functions. Let's go with the more traditional spelling. Functions. And there we go. We get back the number 8. We also go back to number 32 because that's something further down in the program that I meant to comment out. But I'll go ahead and leave that in there. We fed in a 4. We got back an 8. Obviously, feed in a 5 here. And got to remember to save it. Go over here, up arrow, and we get back 10. That's what this function does. It's very simple. Double any number that I put in. All right, well, let's look at a different one. Here's a function called do some math. And let me comment out string methods here. We'll get to that in just a minute. Do some math is just a little more complicated. Let's say that it's not good enough for me to just double a number, but I've got a little bit more complicated calculation that I want to run here. So I got the word function, do some math in camel case. Once again, I'm just going to pass in one parameter here. I could pass in several or many. I'm going to ask it to console log to this terminal down here. And I want to take n, multiply it by 15, and then the product of that, let's divide it by 3.3. That's a fairly complex calculation. I'm sure you could do it in your head, but I cannot. Let's pass in the number 8, and let's see what happens here. We'll have to save our file and then run it. And I'm sure that is the right number. Now, it doesn't matter what we pass this function. I can pass it 88 and run it once again. And that is the beauty, of course, of writing a computer program. Hey, a nice round number there. It does the work for us. And we just wrote a very simple function to do that. Now, let's spend what time we have remaining here looking at a function called string methods. Once again, I chose the name. Could be anything. And we'll manipulate some strings. Now, first of all, what is a string? A string is anything between quotation marks. A string can be a sentence like this. It could include numbers. It can include punctuation and spaces. When I first started programming and took a programming class, I was surprised by all the time we spent dealing with strings. And I thought, well, I didn't get into programming to figure out how long a string was or to reverse it or to cut out characters and do this and that. But I came to realize that much programming involves dealing with strings. If you think of Google as a search engine, Google's entire business at the beginning was cutting strings apart, analyzing them, comparing them to other strings, and thereby writing an algorithm that enabled us to type in a few letters and find practically anything we're searching for. Much programming involves dealing with strings. And so here we've got a string. Here we have a function called string methods that I'm going to demonstrate a few string methods for you. These are things that are built into JavaScript that you can do yourself. So here we define it with the word function. We've got the camel case name. We're going to pass in a variable called str. That could be anything, any word I wanted it to be, but str is conventional. It stands for string. We've got our two parentheses here. And we're just going to use a JavaScript method that's built into JavaScript and say, what is the length of this string? So let's pass in 7 years ago and run it, and that's not it. So hang on just 1 second here. And Oh, I forgot to save my file. Very common mistake on my part. Try it again. And this time, the length of that string it has 32 characters in it. And you can count them later. That does not include the quotation marks, but it does include the spaces and the punctuation here at the end. All right, that's built into JavaScript. It's just very easy and very straightforward. Let's uncomment this one. Console log string to uppercase. Oh, got to remember to save it. Run it. You probably guessed that that's what it would do. Very useful. It's a shortcut to doing it yourself. And here's one that contains several string methods that I won't explain thoroughly right now, but it's a little bit fun here. Let's see, I messed up with my typing, which again is a very common mistake for me. This one says take the string and split it, and these two quotation marks with no space between them means split each letter. So it takes each letter, splits it, stores it temporarily, reverses them alphabetically, and then joins them back together. These are just built-in JavaScript methods, and we will look at those sometime in the future. But we'll save that and run it and see what happens. And there's our sentence written backwards. So what you can do with functions is really limited by your knowledge and your imagination. Any repetitive or complex task that your program will need to do, you can build that into a function. You can call that function once or preferably many, many times in your program. And in fact, something as simple as this one, double me, anytime that you have to do something more than once in your program, that's a good time to think about using a function and calling a function, because why write the same code out twice when you can put it in one of these little factories called functions and call it once, twice, 100 times, 1,000 times, as many times as your program needs it.